I was born in Lethbridge, Alberta. My father was a farmer. He learned to fly after World War II. I was just a babe in arms when I had my first flight. I don't remember that, but I do remember when I was probably 2, 3 years old, sitting on his knee and playing with the controls, like the stick and the throttle up here. And I just loved it. I thought it was just wonderful to be up there in the sky and looking down on everything. Anybody asked me, what are you going to be when you grow up? And I'd say, I'm going to be a pilot. So I was very fortunate. My father encouraged my interest in flying. He was very supportive of my career choice. He warned me. He said, it's going to be difficult, but if that's what you want to do, he says, we'll help you. My 17th birthday. Well, we drove to Lethbridge that day. And rather than stopping downtown Lethbridge, we continued out to the airport. And we stopped at the Lethbridge Flying Club. We got out and we walked inside, and my father had arranged for my first lesson. When I started flying lessons, I just, like a duck to water, I really, really enjoyed it. I soloed after 5 hours. Like normally it takes 10 to 15 hours before first solo. And I completed my private pilot's license by driving to Lethbridge. I get up at 4 o'clock in the morning on the farm, and it was an hour drive to Lethbridge. And I take my lesson by 6 o'clock in the morning because the wind would start to blow by 7, 8 o'clock. I started my private pilot's license in July of 1964. Of course, I've had to go back to school in September, which was grade 12, but I studied for my written exams, and I completed my private pilot's license September 30th. So I did it in 2.5 months. In high school, of course, we had a career counselor, and we had to do aptitude tests and such. And my score was very high in mechanical, but outdoors. And he said, well, how are you going to combine that? And I said, I'm going to be a pilot. And he sort of looked at me with this strange look in his face and said, but there are no women pilots. I said, oh, yes, there are. You can't tell me there are no women pilots. He says, well, not with the airlines. And I said, well, there will be. I found a brochure from Air Canada listing their pilot qualifications requirements. In this, it described how they wanted a pilot to have so many hours of flying time, an air transport rating, and preference would be given to those who had a university education. So right then and there, I decided that I was going to go to university. I wanted to continue for my commercial license and my instructor's rating. My first year at university, and I drove out to the airport, and I went into Chinook Flying Service, and here is a woman instructor, and I thought, wow, this is really neat. I want to meet her. Her name was Gina Jordan. So I introduced myself, and we got chatting, and she ended up doing my commercial pilot's license training. So I built up my time using my dad's Cessna 170 and flying with Gina. I would fly from the farm up to Calgary and do a couple of hours of flight training with her, and then fly home the same day. So I would get a fair amount of time, flying time, and it took me 1 summer to get my commercial pilot's license, and then it took me another year to get my instructor's rating. The airlines require an air transport rating, which is 2,500 hours, and I wanted to, I couldn't afford to pay for that 2,500 hours. I had to have a job that I could build time and get paid for it. So I applied to flying schools across Canada, and the Winnipeg Flying Club responded and said that they wanted me to come to Winnipeg as an instructor. So I loaded up my little car and drove across the prairies, and ended up in Winnipeg in about April of 1970. Instructing was just the greatest. To take someone that doesn't know one end of an airplane from the other and teach them how to operate it and how to do everything correctly, do the different maneuvers that are required and to take off. And landing is always a challenge. I instructed for 3 years at the Winnipeg Flying Club, and during that time, I flew as much as I could. I would try for 100 hours a month, which was quite a bit, except in the winter when it was too cold to fly. I probably had about 2,500 when I started writing exams. I wrote off all exams, and I had my air transport rating. I had the university education. I had the number of hours. I had the qualifications, and they couldn't tell me I was too short. I'm 6 feet tall, so and that was one of the height restrictions. The airlines had a height restriction of 5'8", but I did apply to all the airlines across Canada. Back then, there were quite a few airlines in Canada. There was Air Canada, of course, and Canadian Pacific Airlines, Pacific Western Airlines, Eastern Provincial Airlines, Quebec Air, and I sent off applications, and of course, they all came back negative. But I had this little ace in the hole. Transair was a regional air carrier based in Winnipeg. And I had gotten to know a few of the pilots and the chief pilot. And I kept asking these pilots, well, is there any reason why a woman hasn't been hired? Oh, well, there's nobody qualified. They had all kinds of excuses. Women are not strong enough, women are not. Oh, they couldn't possibly do it. We're so superior. Like that. I'm going, I don't think so. It took a few trips to the office to sort of pound on the door and let them know I was there. And my timing was perfect because they were looking for pilots at that time. They had taken delivery of 2 Fokker 28s, which is a twin-engine jet aircraft, and they were looking for qualified pilots. So I brought in my resume one day, dropped it off at the office, and chatted with them. And then later that evening, about 4:30, I just happened to be home, and I got a phone call, and it was the operations manager, and he said, we've looked at your resume. What aircraft do you want to fly? And I went, oh, really? And they gave me a choice. I could be a first officer on the Twin Otter, or I could be a first officer on the F-28. And I said, well, the F-28, of course. I want jet equipment. The next morning when I arrived at the Winnipeg Flying Club, here's a television camera and a crew with a microphone in my face going, we want an interview. The PR fellow must have tipped everybody off. When I was hired with Transair, I couldn't believe it, but I was the first woman in North America to be hired as a first officer, that means actually flying the aircraft, on a twin-engine jet. It was great, but that's not the reason. I just wanted to fly. Give me a chance to fly one of those big airplanes and I'll be happy as can be. One time I landed in Sault Ste. Marie. The flight deck door was open, and one of the passengers was getting off, and it was a lady. And she looked up front and she went, oh my God, a woman pilot. Oh, this is awful. She's my husband won't even let me drive a car. And I went, that's too bad. I've been driving since I was 10 years old, and driving an airplane is no different. When I was hired by Transair, I had a boyfriend. He was a pilot on a Learjet. We got married in 1977. I was hired by the airlines, of course, in 1973. And by 1977, he convinced me that I really could have a career and a marriage and children, and there wouldn't be any problems, because he was very supportive. So, and I guess it was 1979, my uniform didn't fit too good, and I couldn't figure out why. And then I was pregnant. So I continued to fly, and I didn't tell anybody for 3 months. And then finally, my uniform didn't fit anymore, so I figured I had to admit it. So I went to my Transport Canada medical doctor, and I admitted that I was pregnant. And Transport Canada's rules at the time were a pilot who's pregnant is unfit to fly. So I lost my medical. So then, of course, I had to go to the company and say that I had lost my medical and that I wouldn't be able to continue flying. So they sort of, they didn't have anything in the contract for a pregnant pilot because they weren't expecting that, my being the only female pilot. So we came to an agreement that I took a personal leave of absence for a year. It kind of made me angry because if a pilot is on disability, they get disability insurance and their wages continue. A reduced wage, but they're on disability. Pregnancy is not considered a disability. I made sure that they knew that I wanted to maintain my seniority because seniority in an airline, of course, is everything. You know, all your working conditions and promotions, everything is based on seniority. So, they agreed to that, and I had a written leave of absence. 1979, when I was pregnant with my first child, Transair was purchased by Pacific Western Airlines in 1980. When I came off my leave of absence, I was in a transition. They were basing me in Edmonton because the F-28s were gone by then. And I would have to check out on the Boeing 737, move my base, my home from Winnipeg to Edmonton, and I had a baby. So that was a little bit tricky. Initially, rather than move right away, my husband stayed home with the baby while I went to training in Vancouver on the Boeing 737. We scouted around and we found a place to live in Edmonton, actually in St. Albert. Bought a house and moved lock, stock, and barrel to Edmonton. And by that time I was regularly on the line, and my husband was hired by Pacific Western as well to fly the Hercules. So we needed somebody to take care of baby, and I hired a lady to come in the house when I was away, and she'd come in about 15 days a month to take care of him. And it was really easy with one person just coming and going when I had one child. It got really interesting when there was two. Pacific Western Airlines was purchasing Canadian Pacific Airlines. And when they merged everything together, they decided that they had too many pilots. So there were pilots that were laid off. And my husband being one of them, because he was junior to me. And that's about the time I discovered that I was pregnant again. And so I went on another personal leave of absence. And my husband was laid off. I was on a leave of absence, and well, it's a good thing my husband found another job flying Learjet. And because I was on a personal leave of absence, and then my name came up for layoff, I was laid off as well. So I stayed home for almost 2.5 years with my daughter. But the problem was when we came back, at that point, Canadian Airlines was formed, and I was on the Boeing 737. They decided that they needed me in Toronto. So I was based in Toronto. My husband was recalled on the DC-10 in Vancouver, and our children were in St. Albert with the nanny. So there was a lot of commuting back home. And I knew in my heart that there was no use in moving anywhere else because I would get back to Edmonton in time. So I was based in Toronto for, I think I was only there for 8 months. My husband, unfortunately, was in Vancouver for 2 years. But it was quite funny. Looking back on it, it was funny. At the time, it was kind of a disaster. I'm thinking, oh no, I don't want to live in Toronto. But there was an Edmonton pilot that wanted to be based in Calgary, a Calgary pilot that wanted to be in Toronto, and I wanted to be in Edmonton. And it worked out beautifully. I got home. I came back to Edmonton and flew the Boeing 737 out of Edmonton. By then it was Canadian Airlines, and Canadian Airlines was actually a wonderful company to work for. They required pilots, and there was room to upgrade as a captain, and that was in 1990. I upgraded to captain. And that is a full training course as well. It's ground school, flight training in the simulator, and then a check ride and a written exam. We would have to go for simulator training. They can throw any emergency procedure in the book at you. They try to make it as realistic as possible. And in the simulator, it's because it so closely resembles the actual flight deck of the aircraft. You can let your imagination go and you think you're actually in an airplane. But the simulator does everything that the aircraft does. But it's even more sensitive than the aircraft. So you're at a gate and the aircraft pushes back and you start engines and then you taxi, and there's pinpoints of light out your windscreen that are taxiways and runways. And you just taxi the aircraft out and take off, and you have to go through all of the standard operating procedures, and Lord help you if you make a mistake, because there's an instructor sitting back there in the simulator that's noting all of your discrepancies. And you get onto the runway and go roaring down the runway. You think that everything's fine, and all of a sudden the lights are flashing and bells are ringing, and you're going, oh, an engine fire. On the brakes, reject, thrust levers back, speed brake up, stop the aircraft. What is the problem? Engine failure, fire number 2, and then you go through the fire drill. And all of these things have to be memorized, and they have to be done correctly. Otherwise, they make nasty little notes on your debriefing. Well, when I was checked out as captain, I was the first woman captain with a major Canadian Airlines. So it took me 17 years as first officer to attain a captaincy. When I was hired by Transair, I was the first female member of CALPA, Canadian Airline Pilots Association. I was at a meeting of CALPA in Vancouver, and there were probably a lot of the pilots were there. It was a big room, and I was the only female allowed in the room because I was the only female member of CALPA. They introduced me, and I got a standing ovation. I was just, goosebumps. From 1990 till the year 2000, so that's 10 years, it was really great. By about the middle of the 1990s, Canadian Airlines formed a sort of a subsidiary called Canadian North, and we were the Canadian North base. So we did a lot of flying up northern Canada, like Yellowknife, Northern Wales, Inuvik, Cambridge Bay, Resolute Bay, Iqaluit. The jet engine likes cold air, and it performs wonderfully in cold air. But in the spring and the fall, the weather conditions are variable because there's a lot of the warm air is being replaced by the cold air. So there's more snowstorms, there's more fog, more bad weather conditions in the spring and the fall than in the summer or in the winter. In the winter, believe it or not, it's actually beautiful flying in the north because it's clear and cold. With Canadian Airlines, we had routes all over North America, and we were doing what I thought was great, but apparently, financially, we weren't doing so good. And in the year 2000, Canadian Airlines announced that they were financially strapped, and Air Canada bought Canadian Airlines. So there was another transition. I figure I've had one interview and 5 hat badges. And because Air Canada had never used Boeing 737s on their routes, they really didn't want another aircraft type. So they gradually parked a lot of the Boeing 737s. But they maintained the Edmonton base, and we were Canadian North. When Air Canada took over, they maintained Canadian North, but they sold Canadian North to another company. So they were looking to do something with the Boeing 737s. And they formed Zip Airlines. They placed the 12 remaining Boeing 737s and called it Zip. And Zip, if you remember, was the colorful little airplanes, the pink and the blue and the orange and the green. That was actually a fun little airline. It was just the Vancouver base and Edmonton base that flew the 737s. And we were in competition with WestJet. By 2004, Air Canada made some major announcements. They decided that Zip was not working, so they parked all the Boeing 737s and shut down Zip. And they no longer, because they sold Canadian North, they no longer needed an Edmonton base. So in the year 2004, they made this announcement in April, March or April, and there was a bid that came available in July. And a bid is a pilot decides on the aircraft that they're going to fly and the base where they're going to be based. And my husband and I took a look at the bid. The only place that he could go was Toronto as a captain on the A320. And the only place I wanted to go was as a captain on the Boeing 767 based out of Vancouver, doing the overseas. So we kind of looked at this and we went, oh my goodness, this isn't going to work. We've got an acreage, we've got dogs and cat, and we've got 2 kids, and we don't want to go through this being split up again. So anyways, we put in our bid choices, and I guess it was about a month before the bid closed, Air Canada came up with an early retirement package designed for people who were in this situation where they couldn't afford to move. And the criteria was you had to have 3 years left, and I had just turned 57. So actually, I applied for the retirement package, and I received it. So I retired in September 1st, 2004. And it was kind of bittersweet because I really quite enjoyed the flying, and I wasn't ready to give up, but in the long run, it was a good move. I was invited out a lot to the high schools to go in and talk to students about becoming a pilot. My main objective in trying to encourage other young women to pursue a career is I just feel it's so important for women to have do something to take care of themselves, like be independent, strong women that have a career and can support themselves. The Women's Lib went a long way in recognizing the fact that women can do a lot of things that they never thought they could do before, or were not accepted into different careers. And I think that the sky's the limit. Once I'm off the ground, the world looks so different. And I love the changing seasons, the changing of the colors from winter where it's stark white to the greens in summer and the autumn golds, the trees and just looking down on the earth and the patchwork quilts of the prairies. It's just awesome. And a special treat flying in the north is the Northern Lights. Oh my gosh, they are just spectacular. I have had flights where I felt I was surrounded by these curtains of color, and they're just flowing and moving, and every color of the rainbow. And you just feel like they're far above us, but it just feels like you're flying between these curtains of color. And the sky is just absolutely spectacular.